Namibia is full of amazing people, whether local or visiting. Join us for the conversation, where we discuss these incredible projects, interesting topics, and what makes Namibia so special. Today at the conversation, it is all about green hydrogen. Now, if I may, I think I might be the perfect host for this one because I don't really understand the technicalities behind it, but we are very lucky to have an expert in-house, Marco Raffinetti, who is here to help us and to guide us. And let me add right up front regarding green hydrogen and the conversation ongoing in our country. And I think on behalf of Gondwana, we are such a proud Namibian company that we always want to position ourselves to be part of the solution in a balanced and in a rational way. Us Namibians can sometimes make life difficult for ourselves. I love it that we live in a free country where we can criticize, where a company and a brand like Gondwana can get criticized and get complimented. And sometimes I feel that some of the criticism is a bit unfair. It doesn't matter. I love it that we live in a free country. So green hydrogen is becoming one of those. We must be careful to become like some other countries in the world where it's polarizing, where you're either on the one end, green hydrogen is the savior of all, and it's going to solve all our problems, and then you need to believe everything in this box. Or on the other hand, it's a big scam, it's going to destroy our environment, and nothing is going to come of it. Now, we are better than that as Namibians. So let us have the conversation in an unemotional, in a rational way. Let's speak with the experts involved, and then we make up our minds. And that is exactly what we try to facilitate today. So, Marco, thank you so much for your willingness to chat to us and for your kindness and providing us with your time.
It's an absolute pleasure. I think your opening sentiments are incredibly important. So one of the reasons why we chose to participate in this process for the first project in Namibia was because of the governance in Namibia, the freedom of speech, the free press. These are critical, fundamental building blocks that we think are very, very important to developing projects. So your sentiments, I couldn't share them more. We enjoy a fact-based discussion around how hydrogen can assist in Namibia's economy. Certainly, we don't see it as a silver bullet. You need to have a balanced economy that includes many additional sectors. But we think it's got a meaningful part to play for Namibia. So looking forward to the discussion.
Before we get to that, let's start with the person, Marco behind Hyphen. Tell us your story.
So, it's always quite fortuitous how you end up where you end up in a position. I've spent the majority of my life in the project development space. I arrived in that direction coming out of finance. So I qualified as a chartered accountant. I went to London, was working in corporate finance and mergers and acquisitions. I studied and became a chartered financial analyst, charter holder, and then did a master's in tax. And with all that experience, I then went into the business world. I joined a very large logistics company group in South Africa, shipping, logistics, etc. And we then embarked on a 10-year journey where we grew that business 100-fold, investing in ports, terminals, railways, clearing and forwarding, abnormal cargo handling across the entire African continent, working in partnership and in joint venture with governments in infrastructure assets. And that's quite a unique way of working because most of the world, the private sector works as a private sector and the government is just an enabler. And typically in Africa, you see governments wanting to be involved in projects that they see as being critical to their success, be it ports or railways. It's very uncomfortable for governments just to concession those out to the private sector, as has been done in some countries in the Northern Hemisphere. It's seen as too critically important to government, so they want to participate in that. So effectively taking all that expertise, working also in the power sector, doing gas to power projects for a long time, I thought that gas would play a bigger role in the energy transition and was working in projects in the South African sector. And through all of that, even looking at developing a bulk terminal in Luderitz in early 2008, have quite a lot of experience in Namibia. So the previous company I worked with, we ran the Walvis Bay bulk terminal. So I have a long-standing linkage into Namibia and an understanding of the country.
I hope you've had time to travel around our beautiful country.
I have. I've even brought my family down, and last year we spent a bit of time traveling the country. They had never really seen it properly. My wife had, but not my kids. And I've just bought myself a motorbike so I can spend my weekends touring and getting to know the country a bit better.
That's perfect. So let's chat Hyphen. I think give us a summary in terms of where Hyphen started and where we are today, because I think in the beginning there was a lot of unknown for us Namibians, and a lot of progress has been made, but a lot of progress still needs to be made.
Yeah, so I think it's good to look at the program. I think the world really woke up fully to the opportunities of green hydrogen probably in the last towards the end of the last decade is when the commerciality of hydrogen became apparent. Before that, there's been large green hydrogen projects, and most people don't know that the largest green hydrogen project on the African continent is in Zimbabwe, commissioned in 1975 using water from Kariba in order to drive the electrolyzers, to make the electricity to drive the production of green hydrogen. So it's not new. It's just the technology on the electricity generation side had never been cost effective enough. And what you've seen over the last 20 years is just this massive scale up in renewable energy technology combined with a massive scale down in price. So 90% odd reduction, between 70 and 90% reduction in solar, wind, and battery technologies. And really that then opened the window for green hydrogen to now be produced commercially. So, and I think Namibia saw that. A lot of people in the private sector, like the partners in Hyphen, had seen that. And really, they then started looking collectively at locations around the world for the development of green hydrogen. And that then coincided with Namibia developing its strategy and saying, well, this is something that they'd like to support. And ultimately, it's a combination of, it's not, people are quite confused by green hydrogen, but it's relatively simple. You need space that isn't occupied by somebody else because you need to put up wind and solar, so it needs to be free of other activities. You need water, but most importantly, you need a government that's willing to support it, and you need a country that has a low risk profile, which Namibia has. And together, the shareholders came together, they formed a consortium, and they bid in the process that government ran in order to allocate out the first land parcels. And how the consortium came together is effectively there's two fundamental building blocks. You've got a technology company in the form of Enetrag, which is one of the first German wind energy producers, and they commissioned their first green hydrogen plant in 2011, way ahead of the curve, way ahead of the commerciality of it. Because again, you could see that this is where you would end up. It was just when you draw a line, you couldn't determine exactly when it would become commercial. And then on the other side, Nicholas Holdings has got a track record of doing investments in the infrastructure space in Africa in partnership with government. And it's a very different business model. So if you look at the independent power producers, typically you're working in a confined market. So an energy market is regulated in a country. There's a set of rules, there's a standard contract, and you're bidding against other people in a very confined in a very confined world, where green hydrogen is an international energy market developed in partnership with government as the key enabler of the program on state-owned land, as part of a government program. And it's more of and the economics of setting up that business model is quite different. And the infrastructure that needs to be built is everything. So we need to build port infrastructure, logistics infrastructure. So it's not just about having technical expertise on wind and solar and electrolyzers. You need to know how to put a transaction together in partnership with government and build out all the common use infrastructure and linear infrastructure in order to enable a project. And that's really how the two shareholders came together in order to bid on this first procurement round.
And once those common use infrastructure, you talk about ports, railway, once those are in place, I mean, something like Lüderitz, like Walvis Bay, obviously all other sectors can benefit from that infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's certain connectivity infrastructure in economies that are massive drivers of multiplications of economic growth. And so as part of our tender submission, when we submitted for the project, a key design was saying we need to have common use infrastructure, because ultimately the world needs multiple projects. The first one is always by far the hardest to execute. But because there's so many things that need to be put in place, and you can't have a single point of failure in that entire value chain. But once the first project is set up and is in place, to add on a second and a third and a fourth project becomes significantly easier. So what we worked very hard with government is to define a model that enables the establishment of common use infrastructure, with the first project effectively overbuilding the capacity that is required in excess of what we need for other projects to benefit from. Because we think that's very important from consumer countries. When they look at Namibia, they're not just looking for a one-off project. They're looking for a pipeline of projects that can meet their energy needs. Because although our project is large, it only will decarbonize one large steel mill if you had to put it into the steel industry in terms of making green steel. So we need thousands of these projects, not tens or 20s, like you have thousands of oil and gas projects. So there's a few countries in the world like Namibia that can centralize plan, because the government is the owner of a large amount of the land, and it is so sparsely populated. Most countries, if you fly over them, it's a patchwork of every little square piece of land is taken up by some activity or another. Namibia is quite unique in that it doesn't have that constraint.
And at that place, where we have the land available, and it obviously also comes with caveats, and we'll chat about the environmental impact, but we have wind and sun there as well, which I suppose helps the business case.
Yes, so again, the economics of green hydrogen is relatively simple. The largest input cost is the cost of electricity. It's around 70% of the entire capital expenditure. So because it's such a big component, you really want to be able to yield the maximum from that equipment. And I think the best way to think about it is you've got a factory that makes the hydrogen, and the factory's got two inputs. It's got electricity and water. So water is relatively simple. You desalinate it because it is a water scarce country, not just the region down in the Karras region, but the whole country is water scarce. So you don't want to impose upon that existing water scarcity. So water in, and then effectively electricity in, and that energy then breaks the molecular bond. And the uniqueness of Luderitz is that your wind blows at night and your sun blows during the day. So if you've got a factory and your factory makes hydrogen, you want your factory to have a steady stream of water and a steady stream of electricity. So there's no point having your wind blowing during the day and the sun in the day, and then nothing at night, because then your factory's standing idle at night, or you need massive battery packs in order to provide the energy at night. So if you were to throw a dart at the map of the world and figure out and hit a place where the wind and the solar are at different, night and day solar, night wind, and they are at a high level of generation capacity because the wind is exceptional, the solar is exceptional, to drive a low cost of electricity, to drive a low cost of hydrogen, that single place in the Sarko-Heb is we think in the lowest three in the world. And like any resource, ultimately this is a resource that you're selling to the world. You want to be the low cost producer of the resource. If you want to have a sustainable business model, you don't want to be a high cost producer.
So we have the resources. We have something going for us from a competitive perspective. Marco, so you've touched on a few things in terms of the tender. So I think a lot of progress has been made, but there's a lot of talk happening, and obviously no impact on the ground, or little impact on the ground, as of yet. Where in the process are you now in terms of making decisions and going forward?
Yeah, so essentially we've done all what we'll call the early studies, all the pre-feasibility work. So working out if there's fatal flaws or technical difficulties that can't be overcome or can only become overcome at a cost that doesn't make the project sensible. So all that work has been done over the last 2 years or so, and now we're in what we call the front end engineering design. So it's hardcore engineering design. So it's diameters of pipelines, capacities of water desalination plants, size of solar arrays, the technical specification for electrolyzers, technical specification for the ammonia production facilities, port designs for the export infrastructure, port designs for the for the importation of project cargo to build out the project. We're really in that very, very hardcore engineering phase. And that ultimately drives the final capital cost of the project. Together with that goes the putting together of the financing structures. So I spend a large proportion of my time actually talking to financiers because we talk about the cost of production of green hydrogen. There's really two big components. It's the cost of your equipment and the cost of electricity. And quite simply, in Namibia, if you have to put up a wind turbine, you need to get the same amount of energy out of it in Europe or in Korea or Japan, you need 3 or 4 wind turbines for the same amount of output, and maybe 1 solar panel for the equivalent output of 3 solar panels. So that's really what drives the overall economics. But another big driver is what we call the cost of financing. So the best way to think of these assets, it's a fixed cost investment that you make, and then you've got very small variable cost. So effectively, you build huge solar, huge wind, water pipelines, desalination, ammonia, export facilities, and then you've got a very small amount of your costs as actually operating costs. So effectively, because you're bringing in financing in order to pay for all of that, the cost of financing has a disproportionate impact on the cost of your final product that you manufacture. So we work very, very hard in driving down the cost of financing. And this is where I think a lot of people in Namibia don't understand the uniqueness of Namibia as one of the most stable democracies on the continent, but stable not just on the continent in terms of global peers, the freedom of the press, the balancing of the budget, the discipline around the rule of law. Now, all of these are fundamentally important drivers to drive down the cost of financing, because ultimately, to mobilize billions of dollars of funding, you need trust, because trust is what the price of money is trust. The lower the trust, the higher the price of money. But also, what you're talking about is importing nations putting their energy security onto Namibia. So there's trust in both in terms of the cost of the money that you mobilize, but also in terms of where those importing nations are going to place their energy security. And we think in a changing energy landscape, that decision around which countries will be invested in to receive or to be exporters of green energy is going to be a very big driver of how this industry unfolds over the next few years.
I want to understand the role of exactly that, of call it partnerships. We read in the media of German delegation or an EU delegation or a Japanese delegation being here regarding the green hydrogen. So what is the role of that? Is it from a funding perspective? Is it from an off-take perspective, or is it all of the above?
So I think maybe just to take a step back is to look at how the world will look to decarbonize. So I think there's quite a lot of confusion around what is the role of green hydrogen in a energy decarbonization system. So if you go look at the earliest presentations that Hyphen did, the best way to decarbonize an energy system is what we call direct electrification. So you put up new wind, new solar, and you with a battery to balance that energy supply between production and consumption. You use that directly in your industry. Next is then what we call hard to abate sectors. So those are sectors that you simply cannot decarbonize without green hydrogen. So you can't decarbonize a ship with a battery. Or you could, but it's probably not going to be very efficient because batteries are very heavy and most ships are moving big, heavy things. So you don't want to take up the cargo carrying capacity of the ship with big batteries. Also, charging a battery for a ship of that scale to go into ocean voyages would be quite difficult. So that industry, certain heavy logistics applications, green steel manufacturing, all of that requires green hydrogen. And if we work out what that means in a net zero by 2050 that the world is committed to, you need around 500 or 600 million tons of green hydrogen to meet that demand. And if you look at the way the world is broken up between who has got resources to produce green hydrogen and those countries or regions that need to consume green hydrogen, you can almost think of it like the US, India, and China are big industrialized economies with big carbon emissions that they need to abate, but they have renewable resources and the demand for their energy. So they will produce and consume within their country. Then you've got countries like Europe or regions like Europe, Korea, and Japan, which are also major industrialized regions, and they don't have the resources and they don't have the land. So China, Korea, and Japan in particular, they're very small island nations, but big industrialized nations. And they need to decarbonize because they export into Europe, and Europe is going to put tariffs on them based on the carbon intensity of their products. So they need to decarbonize their automotive industry, for example, with green steel. So we see those markets of Europe and Korea and Japan. That's what drives interest from those countries in Namibia. That's why they're here, because they can't decarbonize on their own. So they're going to have to import from Namibia or other countries in order to meet their energy needs. And that means that Namibia's got three potential markets, large markets that it can supply into. And now excluding now international shipping that'll use green energy, that's sort of like an international market. But in terms of geographic markets, those are the three core ones. So you see there was a delegation from Japan coming to Namibia, delegations from EU and from various countries in the EU, like Denmark and Belgium and Germany, and Holland, with a keen interest in this energy transition. And then within those countries, you have financiers, and within those countries, you have producers of technology. So you can see there's an ecosystem that then gets built up, because we can go to China for solar panels, we can go to Europe for wind turbines, we could also go to China for wind turbines, and effectively put together a consortium of partners in order to execute the project. Because of a project of this scale, you require enormous number of solar panels, enormous number of wind turbines, electrolyzers, ammonia synthesis technology, pumps, pipelines, steel. All of those commodities need to be brought in, because Namibia doesn't produce any of those. And so if you think of the partners that you bring into these projects, it's firstly around the countries that are going to place their energy security on Namibia. Then it's customers within those countries that would like to buy Namibia's energy. Then there's producers of technology who would like to sell their technology to the project. Then you've got construction companies, big international construction companies, that would like to come in and partner with local construction companies to build the project. And then you've got the financiers in those countries that then enable the raising of the appropriate capital in order to execute the projects. So a huge number of moving parts and strategic partners across that entire value chain.
So we have the resources. I think that box is ticked, and you're busy now with the the engineering design and the financing. So that is still it's still up in the air, if I can say like that. And then there are potential off-takers. But in between all of these are the maths, the numbers, and even us in tourism understand that that it must add up in the end. And it is, I think, a unique scenario, because it's not all about commercials. It is about this drive to decarbonize, which we have to do. It's ironic. I feel that a country like Namibia, is getting the short end of the stick in terms of the impact of climate change. Yet, our contribution to that is minuscule. Be that as it may, in terms of where you sit today, maybe it's a bit of an unfair question, but the viability and the numbers in terms of given these, it's not purely commercial. It must be commercial as well. But all these inputs into this pot. How do you see both your project and green hydrogen generally going forward?
Yeah, so I think it's an exceptionally important question, and I think it's quite poorly understood where we are and where the trajectory will ultimately lead. And maybe to answer that question, I'm going to talk about wind and solar and batteries, because effectively 20 years ago, the hydrogen industry wasn't exactly where the wind and solar industry were 20 years ago. So when the first wind and solar projects were built, they were more than 10 times the cost of conventional electricity generation technologies. But again, if you looked at it fundamentally, the scale up of wind and solar, there was a technological improvement. You improve the quality of and the outputs from your solar panels, you improve the technical design of your wind turbines, you increase yields. But those yield increases from technological advancement were relatively small. The big advancements come in just mass scale manufacturing. So it's just pure economies of scale, simple economics. If you're setting up a new car factory, if you make one car, 100% of the cost is on the first car. Once you scaled it up to 100 cars, the cost comes down. 1,000 cars, the cost comes down. 1,000,000 cars, the cost comes down. And effectively, if you look at what happened in wind and solar in the last, just take the last 10, 12 years, the scale up has been tremendous. So humanity today will build 1 gigawatt of solar every single day. 20 years ago, that took us a year. Just last year, the world installed 2 times the entire, in wind and solar, just wind and solar, 2 times the entire installed capacity of generation capacity of the African continent in 1 year, which is a 65% increase on the previous year, which is now set to double by 2030. So if you look at that in terms of scale, if you take Eskom or South Africa as the biggest installed energy base, they've got about 50 gigawatts of generation capacity. 9 times that was built in 1 year just in wind and solar. And another common argument that gets that people say, oh, but this is only a northern hemisphere Western problem. Nobody else has really cared about decarbonization. 65% of all their capacity installed last year was in China. So China is building wind and solar like you cannot believe. Unbelievable scale. And those prices will continue to come down. I think we've seen the majority of the cost curve has come down. But today, the quickest and cheapest way of bringing new generation capacity onto the grid is wind and solar. And what has gone with that, and again, the technology has been so rapidly advanced, is the battery technology. So there's been a massive technological increase, but again, it's all around mass manufacturing with these massive gigafactories getting built all over the world. And the battery prices have fallen by around 70%. Just in our own design, we underestimated how rapidly battery prices would fall from the time that we bid into 2021 to where we are today. And that battery trajectory has still got a long way to go because we're still in the early phases of that scale up. And then on the electrolyzer side, that is the one area in the technology box that still needs to mature. So I would say the 2 areas that need to mature are electrolyzer technology. The price of that will come down because electrolyzer technology needs to still go through that mass manufacturing ramp up. And the other area that needs to go through, that needs to reduce, is the cost of financing. So bankers are very conservative people. You'll know in your business as well. The first hotel that you build, your cost of financing of that is relatively poor. By the time you build 5 of them, and they're comfortable with the execution of your organization or of an industry, everybody gets comfortable, and the cost of financing comes down. So if you just use Namibia as neighbor, and you look at how South Africa has managed that transition, the first projects were 10, 15 times the price for electricity than they are today, and the cost of financing has come down tremendously because everybody gets comfortable with the technology. So when you then play that forward over the next 10 years, green hydrogen will become, like wind and solar, will become incredibly cost competitive and will be able to compete like for like with carbon emissions, with fossil fuels. And at the same time, the world is imposing carbon taxes on carbon emissions. So you basically have the traditional way of providing energy increasing with the cost of these carbon taxes, and a cost curve coming down of wind and solar technology and electrolyzers and green hydrogen, and eventually those will cross. And you see that again. That crossing has happened in the renewable sector already. You see it starting to happen in the electric vehicle sector with the massive scale up of Tesla, and now the other automotive manufacturers trying to catch up. And I think always when there's these new technology shifts, I think what's always important to remember is the people who are in the old technologies, they want to continue to make the old technologies because that's what they know, that's what they're good at. So if you use the car manufacturing as an example, everybody ignored electric cars until it became apparently evident to everybody that the future would be electric cars, and then everybody switched. But for a long time, all those traditional automotive manufacturers simply ignored the electric car industry. Some who started, like General Electric, who started in the early 90s, they took all the electric cars and they crushed them. They brought them all back from their customers and they crushed them because they didn't see a future in it. And those skeptics out there need to look at technology evolutions that have happened in the past And those same principles get applied to this industry. And mathematically, through cost reductions, it'll play out over time. So again, with time, these questions all get answered, but there's a lot of debate that happens in the interim while you go through the transition.
I think it's not only vested interest, like the guys who made the the internal combustion engine. It's also us as humanity. Sometimes we struggle with change. Sometimes we struggle with. I think the electric car is a very good example. This conversation 10 years ago would have been completely different around electric vehicles. It is a little niche market. It's not real. It's not viable. It's not economically. So I think there's also a change management aspect in terms of going forward. And dare I say, us Namibians are probably particularly, guilty of that. I think sometimes we struggle to understand the role that we can play in the global market, given the resources that we have. I like the caution that comes with it, but surely we must also embrace. We don't have a lot of, and we shouldn't think that we have a lot of choices when it comes to development. We still have a lot of poverty and inequality in our country, and we need to address that by all means, of course, by viable means, but by all means. But Marco, do you see?
Sorry, maybe just to come on that. So for whatever reason, there's this undue focus on green hydrogen. I think because it's new and it's different, and there are so many unknowns. But to have a balanced economy is to have multiple drivers of economic activity. So what we haven't spoken about is the linkage between green hydrogen production and critical raw materials that are required in the energy transition. So Namibia, I'm not an expert on this, but I can talk generally to the topic. Namibia does seem to be sitting on a large number of the critical raw materials that are required in the energy transition. So when you see Japan and Europe coming to engage with Namibia, there's two topics that they talk about. Green hydrogen, but also those critical raw materials that are required. The difference between critical raw materials and green hydrogen is one is a renewable resource and one isn't. One's a finite resource. So you mine it like the diamonds, you mine them and then they're gone. Where the wind and the sun, if you don't capture it today, you capture it tomorrow, and you can capture it in perpetuity. So, and I think that's important. And then the other big industry, which we think, and it may sound counterintuitive coming from someone looking to drive the green energy transition, is the oil and gas. And I think it's an enormous opportunity for Namibia. The reality is today we can't switch off oil and gas. The whole of humanity would come to a grinding halt if we said we're not going to use any more oil and gas. And I think Namibia has an opportunity to do what Norway has done, which is effectively, if you look at Norway's economy, they take their oil and gas, they export it, and they've invested in renewable energy. So 98% or something of the entire grid is run by hydro. That's the equivalent of Namibia's sun and wind. So you can utilize that energy transition and the fact that the world does need oil and gas for the energy transition in order to fund the transition to a green economy. And I think if you look at government strategy, it's very clear how they would like to manage that transition. So, and then you've got the other traditional areas of economic growth in Namibia, diamond mining and uranium mining. Again, nuclear has a role to play in the global energy mix, as well as agriculture. All these things are critically important. So also I think a balanced discussion around all these engine drivers of growth, and all of them should be pursued by government and by businesses in Namibia to have a resilient economy.
And you've touched on so many things now, and I think especially the synergies between all of the above. I absolutely reject this, it's either oil and gas or green hydrogen. I completely agree with you. We live in a country and we unashamedly should embrace our resources, including those resources, given our poverty, our socioeconomic realities. But we have a unique, probably global opportunity to embrace both together and to unlock the synergies between the two. It's not one or the other. It can be both, and we can show the world how we can do both.
Maybe just, I think that's such a critical point, Kay, so maybe just to re-emphasize that. These things are not mutually exclusive. So they're only mutually exclusive if they require the same access to the same resource. So the oil and gas resources are 250 kilometers off the coast. they don't need the same land or port infrastructure that green hydrogen needs, or mining needs. They're completely different. So all of those industries can be developed in parallel, because they don't conflict with them with each other in any way. And there's no economy that's been displaced. If you develop one, it doesn't mean that you can't do another. And importantly, it doesn't result in the redundancy of something that already exists. So this is much harder for, say, for example, in South Africa, where if you roll out wind and solar, you effectively decommissioning coal-fired power stations. So then you've got an economic system that relies on the mining and export of coal. So a third of the revenue in the second or third largest foreign exchange earner for South Africa is the export of coal. So if you stop using coal and coal-fired power stations, then you are not mining coal for export. Transnet is moving, a third of all the cargo it moves is coal. You have a huge economic system that is interdependent, that is displaced. Namibia doesn't have that, because you're importing most of your energy from, or a large proportion of your energy from South Africa, and you have small energy generation potential, or generation relatively in Namibia. But what Namibia can do is utilize abundant renewable energy to accelerate economic growth, because energy poverty on the continent is enormous. And the demand for energy, particularly as you look towards artificial intelligence and you look at the scale up of energy requirements to build out that industry, it's an enormous opportunity for Namibia to utilize those renewable resources to drive economic growth. So again, these things are not mutually exclusive. They all work together and can be developed in parallel. And I think they should be developed in parallel.
And I love how specifically the oil and gas companies, those involved here currently in Namibia have embraced that. Absolutely. You can see that. You can see how they are drivers of that transition. And they're not stuck in the past. And again, I think we now have the platform in this country and all the ingredients to be a catalyst and to be even a global leader on that front. You've touched on mining, and again, it's been a theme, I think, since forever regarding the value add of our resources. And again, I think here we sit with an opportunity to unlock those synergies. Mining is, to a large extent, the backbone of our economy. So I think we to some extent understand mining. It is a huge benefit. It is a temporary benefit because it's finite resources, but obviously also in terms of environmentally, it's got a big impact. I'm proud to be in a country where, I think we are very sensitive about our environment. We understand definitely, at Gondwana that anything that you do in terms of development, or most of it, will have an impact. It's about having that impact being responsible, which I think is super important. And obviously, which is different from mining, you guys hopefully sustainable as well. So talk us through the process that you've gone through in terms of the environmental impact, and for us as Namibians to understand what's happening on that front.
So I think the best way to think about the difference between mining and renewable energy is, in the mining sector, you have to mine where the mineral is. So if you're mining diamonds, for example, you can't hope that the diamonds are in an area that's less environmentally sensitive. They are where they are, and the choices then, from a policy perspective, government perspective, environmental, is the loss of ecological impact of developing that mining resource worth the loss of is the economic benefit worth the loss of biological importance? Because every single thing that humans do have an impact on the environment. The building that we're sitting in today, this was once a natural environment, and I think the difference then with renewables is, if you look at the area where we located in the Sakaheb, the park is 26,000 square kilometers. Our footprint within the park on a worst case basis is around 150 square kilometers. And we think we can get it much, much smaller than that. And that's what the team is doing. But we're cautious to start with what we think is the worst impact and then optimize everything further. But we have enormous opportunity to go into areas, examine factually what's on the ground in terms of ecological importance. And if it's high sensitivity, you just don't go there. And I think this is what is the scale of Namibia is very hard, even for me. Whenever I go in the park, I get the scale of it is just astounding. And effectively, it's like going in with a scalpel to say, we can go in this area, we can't go in that area. And that means sending out environmental teams to be on the ground. But ultimately, we're looking at a tiny fraction of space required for a large economic benefit, done in the most responsible way to the highest international standards. Not Namibia's constitutional standards, Namibia's local environmental laws, but also the highest international standards. So that should be the objective measure: is would any other country develop in accordance with the same standards? And we think that's what's important, is to do it very deliberately. We've gone to such an extent of driving this within our team that our engineering team sits together with our environmental team, because every decision that the engineering team wants to make has environmental impact, and the environmental teams are there to say, but that this area is particularly sensitive for this plant or this animal species. And because the area is so large, we simply say, well, we can just demarcate that as a no-go zone. So if we look at the current design of the project, 90% of all of our infrastructure is located in what we currently understand to be verified through studies, the least environmentally important of that park. And then you have, because most of the biodiversity in that area is clustered around certain areas and geological formations, and those then become no-go areas. And I think that's what's very misunderstood. People think all the park is equal, everything's of equal biodiversity importance. It's like your garden. The lawn is less important than the flower bed and the indigenous trees. So the lawn is fine to go and play with your kids. You don't go, into the, play in the flower beds where you've got sensitive plants. The same sort of logic applies. And this is not something that is just new to us now. At the time that we bid on the project, the single largest piece of work that we commissioned was an environmental assessment to understand whether this was a good idea and whether we thought we could do it in a responsible way, accordance with those high international objective standards.
So if my maths are correct, it's less than a 1% impact.
Yeah, so I think, currently we, depending on how you measure the park, some people say it's 26,000, some people say it's 22,000 square meters, being conservative and taking 22,000 square meters. Now we think we're probably going to be 0.5% of the park, and we hope to get that lower, much lower than that.
And at least in theory, the positive outflow from that, the impact from that can be forever.
Correct. And that's why, the studies that we do, the environmental approval process that we go through, it's called an environmental and social impact assessment. And the social is important because everything we do as humans has an environmental impact. And the counterbalance to that is always, is the social impact, does that justify the environmental impact? Because if it doesn't justify the environmental impact, we shouldn't be doing. Maybe to use an example, if we needed to use 90% of the Sakaheb to mine to strip mine the Sakaheb in order to mine a very low product that's going to have a 1% increase on Namibia's GDP, that would be a terrible, terrible idea. But this is a small impact done in a very deliberate, very careful way for a large economic impact. And typically, that's how you have to weigh these, because it's impossible not to have environmental impact. Every single day, we consuming food that's been built on that's come from a farm that used to be natural land. Every single thing we do as humans, the metals and minerals in your watch and your cell phone, every single human being has had an impact on the natural environment. But we need to not do things the way that we've done in the past. Standards have got so much better. The science has got so much better. We really need to go in with that deliberate science to make sure we design the projects in the right way.
And I love that. I think as responsible Namibians, it's environmental and social impact, and it is so important. Again, if I can use the extremes, on the one hand we can say, no, it's a pristine environment. Let's not go in there. And our fellow Namibians living in shacks, well, bad luck. On the other end of the scale, it is, let the bulldozers run, and let's just destroy, whatever is there in the interest of development. And I think this is it's rightfully so. It's a sensitive aspect, but I think also again the opportunity in this, where we can show the world that we can be world leading. I like the word that you use in terms of scalpel, and certainly the off-takers of the final product. Certainly, they want to go to their constituencies and say, guys, look at where we got this, this green hydrogen. It is done in a responsible manner, and we had a real and a sustainable positive impact on the social as well. And let's talk about that, because again, everything in Namibia is except our country, but everything else is rather small when it comes to numbers. And again, the one number that gets thrown around in terms of the Hyphen project is 15,000 employment opportunities during construction. So as far as I could see, the previous biggest construction or development that we've ever had in the country was the Husap mine that created 3,000. This is 15,000. Is this a realistic number?
So it is a realistic number. I mean, it's naturally a huge number. Our chief operating officer has just finished building for Aliko Dangote the single largest one train refinery, petrochemical refinery in the world. They had 52,000 people at peak construction.
Sure.
So these projects are incredibly large, and it's always hard for us to imagine at scale how big these projects are. I think the real question is, and these are the studies that we now currently embarking with our team, is what are the skills gaps that exist, and how do we bridge those skills gaps in a way that we can localize as many of those jobs as possible. So we've set ourselves this target of trying to get to 90%. That's a stretch target. We'd like to get to 90%, but that requires interventions from us in order to institute specific training on certain aspects to be able to localize those jobs. And there's some jobs that you can localize, and there's some jobs that you can't, because you simply don't have enough time to train a person to a level of skill in order to do a certain activity. So, for example, welding on a ammonia pipeline, you get that wrong, you have a major ecological disaster. So, welders, it's we see people welding things on the side of the road, and we think it's not a highly skilled job. It is a very, very highly skilled job, and you want to trust that to somebody who is an expert. Because the cost of getting that wrong is enormous if you have a failure. So that's what we're now modeling out with the team is how do we manage that in the right way. And there will be jobs across the spectrum. So we'll need jobs at the lower end that are relatively easy to train, like bus drivers, because we're going to moving staff in and out. Obviously, you're going to have catering services. We need to build a large number of roads within the park, which means graders, etc. And those are jobs that 100% will be localized. And then as you go higher up in the terms of the complexity of the roles, that's where it becomes more of a challenge to see whether you can localize those jobs. And I think the caution that I would say is, because Namibia has gone through quite a tough economic time coming out of COVID, but before that, a bit of with the Fukushima accident, some of the energy coming out of the mining sector, there's obviously a lot of pent-up demand, growing population, a large amount of unemployment. People are sort of looking towards it as if Hyphen's going to, we're going to solve the country's problems. We're simply not going to solve the country's problems. We're a project that can help to be an anchor to the start of an industry that in time could scale up and be a major contributor to dealing or helping to arrest or reverse some of this inequality and the lack of opportunities. And I think what I've seen in Namibia when we recruit people, there is a huge amount of talent in Namibia. There's hungry people in terms of opportunity, and there aren't enough opportunities to go around. So when it's desperately sad when we go to the market for interns, and you have people with master's degrees from international universities that are desperate for a chance. And those are the people that we would like to give a chance. And those people, as an example, those are the people we're trying to pull in. I stopped by a policeman the other day at the checkpoint coming from the airport, and he's we got Hyphen branded cars. I know about the project. I qualified as an electrician. I haven't been able to work in that sector. I would love to work in the sector. I'm a policeman because I can't work on my core. That's who we absolutely need to address, and then we need to try and help to address the some of the unemployment. And I think also becomes quite difficult when if you go to Kettmanshoop or you go to Luderitz or you go down or you go down south or you go up north, everybody's, well, we need the jobs because there is this enormous desperation for economic opportunity in Namibia. And I think that's something that is a challenge for Namibia generally. And that's why all those engines of economic growth that we spoke about earlier are critically important, because the economy needs to fire on all cylinders in order to be able to create the opportunities for Namibians. Long answer to a short question, but I think it's complex. So the ecosystem for us is what's so critically important.
I love that, and I as a completely biased Namibian, that is exactly what we need. It breaks my heart when we leave here. On the first corner there are desperate people looking for opportunities, looking for a future. So even the 90%, if you're going to need the 10%, global international skills, it's a complete and should be an utter no-brainer, because we're helping the 90% Namibians. It's the same with the local content on oil and gas. Let's embrace the world for us to change the destiny of our own country and for our own people. I think it is super, super important.
Yeah, I think it's super important, and I think where Namibia is lucky is because you have a small population. So you've got a high level of unemployment, but that unemployment, when you translate it into number of human beings, is somewhere around 600,000 of unemployed. The last time I checked the statistics, with the green hydrogen industry and with the oil and gas industry and a big mining industry that is a major player in the energy transition, you have the ability to lift a country economically in one generation, So again, using Norway as an example, Norway in one generation went from being one of the poorest, if not the poorest country in Western Europe, to the richest on a per capita basis, because they did everything in the right way. They ensured that the economic wealth was structured in a way that there was a sovereign wealth fund. They invested the money wisely. It wasn't narrowly, they brought in international expertise, had a small population, and therefore when you take a big economic activity over a small population, a rising tide lifts all boats. Much harder to do that in a country, say like South Africa, where you've got 65 odd million people and millions and millions and millions of unemployed people. Much harder. So I think Namibia really has an opportunity to use these drivers of economic growth to then invest in all those social infrastructure, training, education, etc., in order to be able to uplift people, social safety nets. You can only do that if you've got a big industry and a small economy. And I think good examples to look in the Middle East is look at Qatar, the UAE. They've done that with their natural resources. And if you look at Singapore, for example, they have no natural resources at all, but they've been able to do a similar model by having the best corporate governance, bringing in expertise where they need it to unlock the economy. Because if you bring the right entrepreneur into your country, they can create thousands of jobs, and that's what you want to do. So it's a fine balance getting that right, and I'm sure Namibia will walk the right pathway in achieving that.
It's clear that we use the word transition. Your carbon energies have had probably centuries to develop and refine the technology. So it's probably difficult on a purely commercial basis to compete with that, even though the example that you've used, especially with solar and wind, it happened fairly quick. But with something like this, it seems that there will be a gap in terms of financing for all of us to make the world a more sustainable place. And it's difficult. I talk about the droughts. I talk about the impact on Namibia, but it's it feels as if it's indirectly commercial. It's actually directly commercial, but indirectly. Yet there's clearly this gap globally. And you say that's where you spend the majority of your time is with the financiers. Do you see willingness and to finance this gap regarding a future that is, I think, it's very clear?
Yeah. So. That was, we didn't get to this on the last point, but yes. So I think, like wind and solar 20 years ago, there was a gap, and a gap exists today, and you can see that with the right policies, that gap can be overcome, and then the market reaches maturity, and then you no longer you can effectively pull the subsidies that are required. I think the challenge in green hydrogen is in wind and solar. You could start with small scale projects. You could put up a few wind turbines, a few solar panels, and you could scale up over time. In green hydrogen, the projects have to be at scale for various economies of scale reasons, and therefore the cost of establishing them is much greater. So a gap does exist, but if you look at the policies internationally, Europe has set up, and already I think today they announced $4.5 billion worth of, or euros worth of funding as subsidies into various green hydrogen projects and technology and energy transition projects. So the policies in Europe are coming, and I think there's a number of ways of thinking of this gap. How does the gap get filled? The one way is carbon is currently underpriced. So the impact of carbon emissions on people's health globally is not priced into the product. So, if you take South Africa, I think it's estimated that around 50,000, because it's got, the reason why I keep on talking about South Africa, I understand it, but also they've got a very large coal generation fleet. It's estimated that around 50,000 people are affected every single year from carbon emissions just from coal-fired power stations. And it's not just the carbon emissions, you've got these small particulates that get into your lungs and damage it. So that cost is currently not in the economic ledger anywhere, but people are dying from it. So the world, what the world is looking at doing is now introducing carbon pricing. And Europe is doing this. They're slowly increasing the carbon price. And they're also putting a trade barrier around Europe to say, well, if you want to sell your products into Europe, you need to have decarbonized them, or you're going to pay, or there's going to be a tariff, and you're not going to be as competitive. So that's what Europe's doing on the, let's say, trying to adjust for the fact that there's an artificial subsidy. The best way to think of it, there's an artificial subsidy for hydrocarbons because they aren't paying the full cost of the impact. Now, you need to do that very responsibly because you don't want to increase energy prices and hurt your consumers that are already suffering in a high interest rate and inflationary environment. So that needs to be balanced. And then on the demand side, what various policies have been set up. So if you take Germany, for example, it's not a debate whether they want to achieve net zero or not. They've made it law. So they have to do it, unless they change the law, which obviously they can. So, and then because they've made it law, they're now coming up with designing mechanisms to help provide the subsidy to bridge the gap. So increase the carbon pricing and then provide some subsidies to bridge the gap. And then over time, the cost comes down and then you can take away the subsidy. So that's basically what's happening in Europe. I think in Korea and Japan, they're looking to not put carbon pricing. They are, but that's not the main focus. They're looking at mechanisms to subsidize the import of green energy into their economies. And they currently import all their energy. So they're in a more difficult position than Europe that can generate some of its green energy itself. So they've taken a bit of a different approach. America has mobilized $350 billion worth of funding in the Inflation Reduction Act to drive its decarbonization agenda. And although it wasn't bipartisan, if you look at where the majority of those investments are going, they're going into the red states. So even with a change, even if there's a change in political party leadership in the US, I don't see them stepping away from those opportunities. So I think the best way to think of it, it's if the energy transition for wind and solar, you could play at the small chips poker table because the level of subsidies were relatively small. Then you move to cars. The level of subsidies now are quite big. The electric car industry, I think the US is around $7,500 per car. I don't know what it is in Europe. And then you move to green hydrogen. The numbers will be bigger because the projects are bigger. But the level of subsidy is going to be sort of a similar percentage as they were in some of those earlier transitions. Well, actually, they'll be much cheaper because the first wind and solar projects were like 10 times more expensive. This industry is going to be much, it's going to be maybe 1 times as expensive as the historical carbon-based supply. And
the demand for the offtake will be because of everything that you've said now.
Yeah, so basically the regulations drive the behavior. So if you look at take the green aviation fuel as an example, there's a mandatory blending requirement. So if you want to fly in and out of Europe, you need to have a certain portion of your energy come from what we call e-kerosene. And if you don't, there's a penalty. And then that penalty is more expensive than buying the green energy. And because it's only 1% of the overall price, it doesn't really have that much of an impact on the ticket price. But it helps of the person flying on the plane, but it helps to drive the adoption. And Europe, Korea, Japan, as import markets, are looking at driving those incentives. And then you have export countries like Australia and like Canada, who are now mobilizing funding to go into fund these offtake support mechanisms so that they can help to get their industries moving as export industries into those economies. Now, obviously, Namibia can't do that. Namibia is a developing nation, so it can't mobilize funding. But what Namibia has is a renewable resource that is better than those countries, so it's already cheaper on the cost curve. And what we're looking at with financiers is working with financiers to lower the cost of financing for Namibia on a sort of concessional basis to make Namibia's green hydrogen more competitive. I can't go into too much detail on that because those are quite commercially sensitive, but we've had very, very good support from providers of capital to enable Namibia to become a large-scale player in this space.
I love hearing that. And frankly, I think also it's a bit due. You know, I think one of the biggest mistakes that we as humanity has made over the last few centuries is we never costed our natural capital, you know, and the impact. And that's why, from a pure economic perspective, you know, some of these will not make sense. But it's ultimately about almost our viability as a species. You know, what am I doing for my children and my grandchildren? We have to make sacrifices. We have to see the future. And like you said, unfortunately, currently, it's not on the economic ledger, but it is absolutely real.
Yep. And unfortunately, it is expensive, but it needs to be done in the most efficient way. So, you know, so electric cars, for example, they've now reached. They've come over the cusp, and even the big car makers are no longer resisting electric cars. They're struggling now to make the transition from internal combustion to electric cars. I think in the electricity generation sector, there's still quite a bit of polarization between some of the players who will push a technology because that's the technology that they have over the new technology. And you see that quite a bit with nuclear and the gas. The people who sell gas-fired turbines, they've got an incentive to sell those because that's what they make. So it's just human nature is going to drive them in that direction. But in the long arc of history, ultimately the lowest cost wins, and that's why solar and wind is now getting built out at a scale that's just simply staggering compared to other technologies. And the speed of scale up compared to all those other technologies is just so much faster. Like the evolution of it is just incredible. You know, to build 10 times the installed capacity of Eskom in 1 year globally. 10 years ago, if somebody had asked me that, I would have thought they're insane. I didn't think we could get that scale. So humans really struggle to understand exponential growth until it's upon you.
But I think you know, this helped me a lot in terms of informing what's happening on the ground, and I think it's good. Again, we live in a free country. It's good. Let the skeptics be out there. Yeah. It's wonderful. Let us be sensitive about the environment. But I really hope us as Namibians can also just keep one eye on the potential upside here, in terms of really setting the tone for the world and for development and for sustainable development in our country, and not one or the other, but literally all of the above.
Yeah, just work on facts. I mean, for us, we engage with the media a lot, and we often get told that's the wrong strategy to engage, because the more you engage, the more people ask questions, and you got the potential for things to be misinterpreted, misunderstood. But we think it's, on balance, we think it's far better to engage and try and explain what the opportunity is, what the technology is, how there's parallels with previous industries that have gone before, what the environmental impacts would be, what the job impacts would be, so people can be informed. So as opposed to it, somebody reading an opinion piece that that is pushing a certain agenda that is not based in facts, we don't think that's helpful. So just being balanced, laying out all the facts, and then ultimately it's for the Namibian people to decide what they would like to do and how they'd like the economy to go forward. And that's why you have a stable democracy, and that's why people can vote at the ballot box. But it's always good for people to be informed around the true facts, as opposed to some polarization of what someone would like you to believe, as opposed to what the real facts are.
Absolutely. Marco, I want to finish off, and let's say, we sit here, it is 2034. You have even less hair because you chose this life path, and I probably have less black hair. Best case scenario, what does your world and our world look like?
So I think in terms of the world, by then I think we would by the late 20s, early 30s, we would have come through the curve of green hydrogen. So it'll now have been, we would have reached that crossover point where it's now competitive with hydrocarbons, and it will be settled. And I think at that point, my hope for Namibia is that Namibia is on projects 4, 5, and 6 of our scale. That's really what Namibia could. We think that's the potential for Namibia. So, what I say to my staff internally is, this project is not going to help the world decarbonize. Namibia can play a material role in helping the world decarbonize, done in the most sustainable way for Namibia, to make sure that Namibia isn't sacrificing what its core values are, and the economic or the environmental impact of that is appropriate. So you don't want to do more development that is environmentally sustainable. But if that can be done, Namibia can be a major player in the energy sector. And the oil and gas will be important in that, but the oil and gas is probably a 20-year view. So if you only develop the oil and gas, in 20 years, you're sitting with a major, major problem. You're sitting with that example that I spoke about South Africa, with now your major economic activity, a major part of your economy going to zero, because it will go to zero. And that's when green energy will be incredibly important. And there's not many countries in the world that have the ability to develop both of these in parallel. So that's what my hope would be for Namibia. And at a global scale, I think the world's going to look very different. And I think it's inevitable that the scale-up of green technologies will take place, because the cost is it's so cheap now that the economics are just so compelling. And ultimately, that's how you drive human behavior, is when the economics get to a point that it becomes self-fulfilling. It's always quite difficult in the early stages. But once you cross that threshold point, it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, like you've seen in the automotive sector.
Marco, thank you so much. I really, as a proud Namibian, we at Gondwana, we really, really wish you well. We need to support anything and everything that can take our country forward in a responsible manner. You spoke about values, and let us hope and let us dream. That may that policeman, in 10 years' time, be a senior electrician. In the Hyphen project, and many more like him. So thank you for your time, and thank you for being here.
Absolute pleasure, and I hope that we can do this again as we develop through the project. I say to the staff when they join us, I say, this is national service. You should look at this as national service, because never in my life have I been given the responsibility of a project that can change a country. I mean, that's really what it means, and it's an enormous weight of responsibility, but it's incredibly motivating at the same time. And I do hope that this has helped to provide more information to Namibian voters and people, so they can understand the sector a little bit better. And we'll look to do more of these types of engagements to try and help people understand what the opportunity is, so they can make that value judgment for themselves, whether they think it's a good idea or not. But certainly from my side, I've really enjoyed the discussion, and hope to do it again.
And man to man, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for that, and for your willingness. I often say at Gondwana, our bravery is only exceeded by our naivety. But we have to.
That's lovely.
Otherwise, we will not. Otherwise, we will not change the future. And to have that desired impact in terms of national service for our fellow countrymen out there who have, who doesn't have the luxury to talk about these things. They just need a better future and opportunity. So really, from the bottom of my heart, on behalf of Gondwana, so thank you. Nothing is guaranteed in terms of success, but we really, really wish you well on behalf of our country.
Thanks very much, guys. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Marco.